Adam Kahane, we're very proud to have him here this afternoon, is the director of Rios Partners, an international social enterprise that helps people move forward together on their most important and intractable issues. His organization just works with public issues.
Good afternoon. I've never been to a ODN meeting or a IODA meeting, but it's a very warm feeling for me to be here, particularly to see or realize that are here or were here yesterday some of my mentors and teachers and people whose work has really influenced me, Bob Crosby and Sandra Janoff and Ed Schein and Barry Johnson and Barry Oshry. So this is very nice for me, and I'm reminded of the capacity and the sophistication of this community and the potential of this community to make a contribution in the world. And what I want to talk about this afternoon is what I think is needed to realize the potential which is present in this community. The three books that I've written, Solving Tough Problems, takes this idea of three kinds of complexity and focuses on how we talk and especially how we listen. Power and love. Two people came up to me and said, I really want you to talk about love. So anyhow, I've mentioned the word. I've done my job. There it is. I mentioned love. The whole book, Power and Love, is based on one sentence of Martin Luther King Jr. In one of his final speeches. He said, "Power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. This collision between immoral and powerless morality is the central challenge of our time." Now I've saved you having to read the book. But actually, I think the strongest message of that book is that overall in the world, the general problem is power without, the most prevalent problem is power without love. Many of us got into this field because we were aware of the reckless and abusive consequences of power without love. But I think in the OD community, as a generalization, I would say it's the opposite problem, the problem of being sentimental and anemic. So there, I've talked about love. I can leave it there. The third book, Transformative Scenario Planning, is a more technical book. It argues that in this kind of work, it's surprisingly useful to use this transformative application of scenario planning, of telling stories about what's possible as a way of moving forward. So anyhow, this is the first of the three ways I'm arguing we need to stretch. And what I really want to focus on now is something I'm in the middle of trying to write, or have really just started trying to write, which is about the challenge of collaboration. And I enjoyed going to the bookstore and buying several books. There's a lot of books with the title collaboration with the word collaboration in the title. And what I'm trying to write about and what I want to offer you as a work in progress is the thesis that collaboration is really not as fun and as easy as it's made out to be. That it actually, in many cases, presents a very deep challenge. And what I am arguing is that there is a syndrome which I call the syndrome of collaborating with the enemy. So this is the working title of a new book, Collaborating with the Enemy, How to Work with People That We Don't Understand or Agree With or Trust. And I've had an interesting reaction. All I've written is the title, but I've had an interesting, it's a good title. I'm happy with the title, but I've had an interesting reaction to this title among my colleagues. People really don't like the word enemy. They say, well, we don't, these people, they're not enemies, they're adversaries or opponents. But what I want to argue is that in many of these situations, more commonly than we like to think, we deal with others as if they are enemies. Okay? And so the syndrome, as I'm calling it, is that we need to work with people who we don't understand or agree with or trust. We see them as different from us. We actually think, whether or not we admit it, that they're wrong or irrational or bad, and we feel frustrated or upset or angry. Bob, you see, after all these years, I still remember the difference between think and feel and want. You'll be proud of me. 2 full years at Leos, and that has stayed with me. And that we see these people as opponents or even as enemies. We wish we didn't have to work with them. We wish that we could avoid them or beat them or eliminate them. We wish that they would go away. We wish that they would go away. And we feel worried or frightened. And what I think is interesting in the word collaboration is, of course, in the period since World War II, in English and in other languages, collaboration has a double meaning. It has the meaning to work with, but it also has the meaning to betray, right? The collaborators. I told a French colleague I was going to write a book called Collaborating with Enemy. He just said, you can't write a book about collaboration. It's a terrible word in France. And that's the idea of the collaborator, the one who betrays. So this idea that to work with the people who I don't agree with or trust, the risk is of compromising or what matters most. And therefore, we don't see how to be successful. So this is the syndrome I am wanting to write about, to talk about, that I think that when we talk about needing to be systemic, experimental, and collaborative, there is a hidden or a not sufficiently appreciated difficulty in collaboration, which is why it often doesn't work. And when it doesn't work, the habitual response is therefore to try to either abandon the field or to destroy the enemy. And I don't think this is of only historical or incidental importance. On the contrary, I think that we're living in a period where the degree of fragmentation and polarization and violence, because of an inability to collaborate with the enemy, is becoming more serious rather than less serious. So I have tried to start to sketch out what it takes to collaborate with the enemy. And if I make a list of what it needs a principled choice that collaboration is necessary and is legitimate and necessary. It requires not compromising on what we really believe. It requires agreeing on what is true about the situation. It requires finding a way not to fight, to focus on the matter at hand, to agree on what is desirable, what's the vision, what are our objectives, what's the best solution that can be implemented, and on that basis to make a deal. Does this list look familiar to you? So I'm arguing that this approach to dealing with people that we don't understand or agree with or like is the habitual response, and it is exactly 180 degrees wrong. Well, I never used that slide before. It really fooled you all, eh? That's good. Okay, that's good. Worked. What I'm trying to tease out is the idea that actually what is required to work with people who we don't agree with or understand or trust is in all respects the opposite of what would be the obvious or habitual response. I think that collaboration is always a pragmatic and a contextual choice. We have to decide in a particular situation, is it better to try to beat them or to work with them? That there's not a principled answer to this question. It depends. It depends on the situation, and the pragmatic part of it is it depends on, can we achieve our objectives unilaterally? Can we achieve our objectives by going around or over our opponents and enemies? One of the most useful words I've found in all of this work, I don't remember where it comes from, maybe from Peter Senge, is this idea of suspending your assumptions, suspending your beliefs, which doesn't mean discarding them, but this idea that we are aware of our assumptions, our beliefs, we hang them as if from a string in front of us so that we can look at them, other people can look at them, we can question them, attack them, but we're not attacking each other. We're suspending the beliefs. Maybe in the end we will say, yes, I still believe that, but maybe we will find actually this belief is not correct or not useful or not applicable. This idea of appreciating multiple truths, this is of course the value of scenarios, multiple narratives about what's possible in the situation. I think the one that's been hardest for me to get my head around is the idea that the wish not to fight is very disabling, whether it's from family of origin or a reasonable fear of violence, but the question is how to fight productively. The Talmud says how to fight for the sake of heaven. There was an interesting critique by, what's his name, Marshall Gantz? Very interesting critique a few years ago of Obama's unwillingness to fight as a disability. I think may have been superseded by more recent events. But that actually focusing just on the matter at hand is not always or even usually the right thing to do. On the contrary, it's when we see the problematic situation in its larger context that we find additional degrees of freedom. I think one of the things which is most contrary in this method is rather than starting by agreeing on what is desirable, on the vision or the objectives, to talk about what is possible in this situation and what is the shared purpose, whether or not it's articulated. This idea that whether or not the purpose is articulated, a sense that there's something we're trying to do together, is more important than agreement on, 1 year hence we want to get this number down to 4.2. This idea in an experimental approach that what is required is not to agree on the one right solution. Even if we could, it's almost certainly going to be wrong, but to agree to experiment and to find out through doing what actually works. And that usually this is not about negotiating a deal. In that sense, the negotiating literature doesn't help us that much. It's about working together over time. We've had a lab going for over 10 years now called the Sustainable Food Lab, and with Milla McLaughlin's leadership, a similar lab in South Africa. And watching this group over 10 years gradually find their way forward through much trial and much error to what actually works to create sustainable food supply chains. I find this work sometimes quite confusing. I've written a lot about my experience in 1996 in a project on child malnutrition in India. And I told the story in Power and Love about really getting confused in this complex and chaotic and conflictual project with what we were doing, and going to a friend of mine, a man named Arun Maira, who was then the head of BCG in India, and saying, what are we doing here, Arun? What's going on? He said, look at him, this is what we're doing. Normally when you have a group of stakeholders from across the system, they come into the room and every one of them, 100% of them believe that if only those other people would change, things would be okay. But if we're all here, then it can't be somebody else, right? And so what we're really doing is helping people, or creating a space where people can see what it is they have to do differently. And this is the 10th part of it, this not focusing on what the other person has to do differently, but what we ourselves have to do differently. I had a joke, a Latin American colleague with whom I did not have a common language, but we used to joke about el click. El click. What was el click? What in a group is el click? El click is the moment when people see, I need to do something different. And when that happened, either individually or collectively, then things could turn. That is one characteristic of what Otto Scharmer calls the bottom of the U. So the third area that this work requires us to stretch is in how we are. And I've been struggling these last few days to find the right language for talking about this, but I do think that there is a more fundamental stretching that's required for this work. And it's the following. It's the stretching from being or seeing myself as an expert, as somebody who knows the answer, who's somebody whose usefulness comes from being smart, to being somebody who doesn't know and whose contribution is curiosity and a way to bring forward the answers from others. I think it involves going beyond being an authority, being in control, having a plan, having a project outline, to realizing that however useful the plan and the outline may be, the truth is that what must happen and what's going to happen is that the situation will emerge over time, and I can't control it. It's counterproductive to try to control it. I have to pay attention to and follow what is emerging. And thirdly, and maybe most fundamentally challenging for this profession, is to go beyond the idea of professionalism. To go beyond this idea that we are apart from or at a distance from the situation, to, in some measure, understanding and accepting and being willing to be part of the situation. There's the old joke that you've probably heard about, in the ham omelet, the chicken is involved, but the pig is committed. So to what extent can we do this work as chickens, and to what extent do we need to be pigs? If I think of the times that I have failed most abysmally and most catastrophically in this work, I think it has been because I have held on to the identity of being an expert, an authority, a professional, which is useful only up to a point, but we have to go beyond this. And this way of being, not being or going beyond being an expert, going beyond being an authority, going beyond being a professional, at least to me, it feels unfamiliar and uncomfortable and unnatural. And this is, I think, part of what is required to do this work. So, in summary, what I'm suggesting now is that there is a new kind of work which increasingly needs to be done in the world. And that there is an enormous possible contribution of organizational development practitioners to doing this work. When I wander around the breakout groups here today, I can see the sophistication of the practice in the field here, but that to do this work, there is a requirement that we stretch far beyond the conventional limits of the field. This means stretching beyond the organization, beyond what can be done in an organization, beyond the mandate or the sponsorship of a boss or of a single client, and beyond best practice. It means going beyond working with friends and colleagues to also being able to work with opponents and also, I would say, enemies. And it requires going beyond the being, the identity of the expert, the authority, the professional. None of this is easy, but I think this is what is needed of us. Thank you very much.